Hello everyone, welcome to the Departamento Loratorum. My name is Max, and today I'd like to talk to you about the Great Scouring. With the recent announcement that a follow-up to the Horus Heresy and Siege of Terra novel series is going to be coming out later this year, some of you may be wondering what exactly it's going to be about. Sure, it's focused on something called the Scouring, but what even is that? How is it connected to the events of the Heresy? And how does all of this tie into modern 40k? Fortunately, we actually know the answer to most of these questions. Like the Heresy before it, the Scouring, also known as the Great Scouring, has existed in lore for decades. Originally existing just as a background event to flesh out the history and current state of the galaxy, it had plenty of ambiguity and inconsistency, given that it was presented as 10,000-year-old myths and legends. But now we're going to be seeing it firsthand. And, using this pre-existing lore, we can know, or at least speculate on, what we're going to be seeing in this new series. In this video, I'll be going over the lore that we currently have on the Scouring. This is not going to be an exhaustive list of every single thing that happened in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. Think of it more as a primer so you can know what to expect going in. I also do want to say that all of this lore is subject to change. Just like the Horus Heresy series before it, some plot points might be altered, expanded, or removed completely to better fit into current lore, especially given the massive expansions of the Heresy and the changes in the state of the galaxy in modern 40k. Despite all that, I do still feel that looking at the current lore for the Scouring is a useful starting point, as it's incredibly unlikely that the Black Library authors are going to reinvent everything from scratch. At the very least, I think the broad strokes and general ideas should remain the same. I'm going to begin with the general overview of the Scouring, just going over what it is as a concept and the broad strokes of what happened, without going into too much detail on individual plot points. If you just want a basic idea of what the Great Scouring is, but don't want to know any of the specific events that occurred, so you can go into the new books fully blind, I'd recommend stopping after that section. This is not going to be a spoiler-filled video though, as all of this information has been around for decades now, and it's still being regularly published in rulebooks and codices and referenced in other novels. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that I recently added memberships to my channel. You can get access to some cool perks like members-only polls, shoutouts and videos, thank you to Wolfrey for joining, and early access to all my videos. Of course, there's no obligation to join, but if you enjoy my content, please check it out. But now, without any further ado, let's get started with a general overview of the Great Scouring. After the turmoil of the Horus Heresy, the galaxy was left in shambles. While the traitors had been defeated and forced to flee after the Siege of Terra, they still held large swaths of territory throughout the galaxy. With the Emperor interred on the Golden Throne and the remaining Loyalist forces greatly reduced, the dream of the Great Crusade was dead. But the Imperium, as it was, could still be salvaged. Led by Reorganization Guilliman, the Loyalist forces purged the traitors' bastions and destroyed their homeworlds, driving them into the Eye of Terror. Hostile Xenos forces who had taken advantage of the heresy to raid and conquer were also defeated. At the same time, the Imperium itself was reorganized, with both the military and administrative bodies being reformed and broken down to prevent one person from ever gaining as much power and causing as much harm as Horus did ever again. Notably, the Space Marine legions were broken down into chapters and spread throughout the galaxy, both in order to limit the impact of any future betrayals, and to better defend the Imperium's borders. New organizations also arose, such as the Inquisition and the Imperial cult. As the years went on, the Primarchs began to fall in battle or disappear, leaving the Imperium fully in the hands of the new High Lords of Terra. Over the subsequent 10 millennia, rot and corruption set in as knowledge was lost or censored, leading to the Imperium becoming the brutal, horrific regime we know from modern 40k. This sounds like an exciting concept for a novel series, especially with all of the added context from the Horus Heresy books. There's a lot of variety, many different characters and plot lines we can follow, as well as more options for varied antagonists to help keep the stories fresh. And we'll be able to see the origin of the organizations, chapters, and warbands that we all know in modern 40k. Let's now move into the specifics of some of the aforementioned plot points, starting with the reorganization of the Imperium. If you want to be completely unspoiled, especially for the first book in the series, Ashes of the Imperium, this is where you get off. Reorganization Guilliman, having arrived on Terra in the final days of the Horus Heresy, both with the largest surviving Loyalist legion and a reputation as a consummate statesman and administrator, took up the mantle of Lord Commander of the Imperium in the aftermath of the Heresy. Seeing the unimaginable damage that had been done thanks to War Master Horus's betrayal, Guilliman set about rebuilding the Imperium and ensuring that no one person could ever have absolute power over so many Imperial forces again. To that end, he created the High Lords of Terra to run the government, basing it off of the Council of Terra that administered the day-to-day non-military components of the Imperium prior to the Heresy. He stocked it with the leaders of many important Imperial organizations, and he himself was placed at its head. Reorganization Guilliman and the High Lords then set about restructuring the Imperial government, creating new organizations such as the Astra Militarum, or Imperial Guard, and Navis Imperialis, or Imperial Navy, which were both created from splitting the Imperial army. as well as the Inquisition, which was founded with the goal of guarding the Imperium against future heresy and treason. But the most dramatic changes took place within the Space Marine legions. Guilliman had seen what a full legion of Space Marines could do if their commanding officer turned traitor, and realized that while the legions had performed well in the Great Crusade, smaller, more flexible units would be needed to defend the vast tracts of Imperial territory. To that end, he proposed splitting the legions into units of 1,000 men, called chapters, based roughly on the pre-existing organizational structure within the 13th Legion, and created the Codex Astartes, a treatise on organization and tactics to be used to guide these new chapters. Not everyone supported these changes, however. Captain Nasir Amit of the Blood Angels, later chapter master of the Flesh Terrors, despised the idea of splitting from his parent legion, viewing the successor chapters as little more than honorless exiles. More notably, the Primarchs Rogel Dorn, Vulcan, and Leman Russ were vehemently opposed to the idea. Dorn, stricken with grief after the internment of the Emperor on the Golden Throne, refused to be moved by Guilliman's arguments, with their dispute getting so intense that the Imperial Navy even opened fire on an Imperial Fist vessel. Eventually, fearing another civil war, Rogel Dorn decided to meditate on the proposal, spending 7 days in a device called the Pain Glove to electrically stimulate his nerves to keep him in constant agony, so he could better commune with his thoughts. After the 7th day of this torturous contemplation, Dorn reportedly saw a vision of the Emperor, believing that he was still watching over his sons. This revelation led Dorn to conclude that the Imperial Fist Legion as a whole needed to metaphorically enter the Pain Glove to be forgiven and reborn anew. In order to achieve this, Rogel Dorn led his sons to the planet of Sebastus IV, where the Iron Warriors under their Primarch Perturabo had built a fortification called the Eternal Fortress. Dorn vowed to dig Perturabo out of his hole and bring him back to Terra in an iron cage. It seems likely that Dorn knew there would be casualties, and that he planned to use the Crucible of War to remake his legion and allow those who would never agree to leave it to die in honorable combat. But it is unknown if he truly knew what awaited him on Sebastus IV. When the Imperial Fist landed, they found themselves walking into a trap, suffering massive losses as the Iron Warriors used traps and the ingenious design of their fortress to inflict heavy casualties on the 7th Legion. The fighting was incredibly brutal, dragging on for weeks. Despite being out of ammunition and forced to build barricades from the bodies of their own dead, the Imperial Fist managed to hold firm and, with the arrival of Guilliman and his legion, were able to escape the battle that later became known, ironically, as the Iron Cage. In the aftermath, Dorn agreed to Guilliman's proposal and split his legion, giving rise to such famous chapters as the Black Templars and the Crimson Fists. The other legions followed suit as well, splitting into successor chapters in an event known as the Second Founding. The Ultramarines, given their size, gave rise to the most successors, although as of the era Indomitus, each first founding legion has sired at least one successor chapter. There was still some resistance, although nothing as severe as the aforementioned Imperial Fists. Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, was at first reluctant to split his legion and followed the tenets of the Codex Astartes, as they had been so reduced by the Dropsite Massacre and subsequent battles in the Heresy that barely enough Astartes remained to fill even one chapter. Due to their reduced size, they were exempt from the requirement to split their numbers, becoming the only legion not to spawn any known second founding successors, and they adopted a modified Codex-compliant organizational structure consisting of 7 companies, which they maintain to this day. The Space Wolves were far more contentious. Leman Russ refused wholeheartedly to adopt the Codex, retaining his traditional Great Company structure, and only after much argument did he agree to split his legion. Only one successor chapter was created, known as the Wolf Brothers, and they received exactly half of the men and resources of their parent legion. The story of the Wolf Brothers ends in tragedy, however, as the 6th Legion gene seed needed to be implanted into Fenrisian recruits in order to remain stable. This genetic degradation caused the chapter to eventually be disbanded, the survivors of the Wolf Brothers turning renegade. It took until the Ultima founding, and the improvements brought by the introduction of Primaris Marines, for the Space Wolves to receive other confirmed successors. Based on the cover we have for the new book, Ashes of the Imperium, it seems likely that it will cover at least some of these events. I also wouldn't be surprised if, given the expansion in the size of Space Marine legions, we are introduced to more successor chapters in the Second Founding, and if we also found out the origin of some Space Marine chapters that were previously obscured, like the Blood Ravens and Carcharodon's chapters. We may even see confirmed successors from Black Shield units or Loyalist Traitor Legion forces. I will be honest, this is probably what I'm the most excited to see in the Scouring series. I just love getting more lore on successor chapters. But to continue, after the Siege of Terra, the Loyalist Legions, and later successor chapters, went out into the galaxy to hunt the remaining traitors. The Ultramarines and their successors played a major role in these battles, as again they were the largest of the surviving legions. They did not retake the galaxy alone, however, as elements of every surviving Loyalist force took part in the campaign later known as the Scouring. Some of the heretics fled immediately to the warp rift in the galactic northwest known as the Eye of Terror, or other isolated areas of space, but many went to their homeworlds or other fastnesses. The Iron Warriors, as previously mentioned, joined their father on Sebastus IV, or occupied other fortresses they had built throughout the galaxy. The Night Lord's Legion managed to maintain some of their unity and gathered under their father, the Night Haunter, on the eastern fringe of the galaxy to continue their campaign of terror and torture. Many of the traitor homeworlds, like Chemos and Barbaras, were destroyed by the Dark Angels and other vengeful loyalists in the final days of the heresy, but others, such as the Wordbearer's homeworld of Colchis, remained. They, along with other worlds that were still occupied by traitor Astartes or who had decided to side with Horus, were purged or destroyed, handed over to the fledgling Inquisition to ensure they remained free of heresy. The former Iterator Kirill Cinderman was known to be an early founder of the Inquisition and a very influential member of the organization. Some planets did rejoin the Imperium of their own free will, although there were consequences if they had sided with the arch-traitor Horus or refused to aid the Loyalists. A good example of this is the world of Ostroia, an industrial world that refused to provide arms to either side in the conflict, opting instead to sit out the war. After the heresy, they were personally called to account for their neutrality by Rabute Guilliman himself. As penance, it was decreed that from then on, the firstborn child of every family on Vostroia would have to serve in the newly formed Astra Militarum, or Imperial Guard, giving rise to the famed Vostroian firstborn regiments. While the Loyalist forces were united in their goal of destroying the traitors, the Scouring was not a coordinated or meticulously planned campaign. Each legion, and later chapter, pursued their own goals and vendettas, as did independent forces that were active during the heresy, such as the renegade Ashen Claws. Many battles were fought that are now only remembered in myth, such as the Genesis chapter's reclamation of their homeworld of Newfound from the Wordbearers. Other chapters saw their future culture shaped by the events of the heresy and the Great Scouring, such as the Excoriators led by the former Imperial Fist Captain Demetrius Cataflac, whose experience defending the walls of Terra led to the chapter's famed culture of resilience, pragmatism, and self-punishment. I imagine that we'll see at least some of these foundational battles and early developments of chapter traditions, especially if the Scouring takes after the Horus Heresy and generating tons of short stories and novellas. Not that I'm complaining, of course. As I said before, I'm always happy to see more successor chapters get some time to shine, and this will be a great opportunity to show off other Imperial forces like the Guard, who did not get as much focus in the Heresy. Really, given the scale of the conflict, there are a lot of opportunities for interesting stories with a variety of characters. We could see anything from minor street-level squabbles to potentially galaxy-altering clashes between demigods. The Astartes were not the only forces active in the Scouring. As I said, the armies of the Astra Militarum and the fleets of the Imperial Navy played their part as well, but so did the forces of the Mechanicum, recently reformed into the Adeptus Mechanicus. They reclaimed Mars and other Forge worlds from the forces of the Dark Mechanicus, driving them into the Eye of Terror and other dark, hidden corners of the galaxy. Given the creation of Vashtor the Archfane as a character and his connection to demon engines and heretical technology, I'd also wager that we're going to be seeing a lot more of the Dark Mechanicum in the Scouring too. The Adeptus Mechanicus also forged close ties with the Iron Hands in the chapter's efforts to reinvent themselves and find new purpose after the trauma of the heresy. After convening a conclave of Iron Fathers, later known as the Tempering, in order to debate how they should proceed in the aftermath of their father's death, the Iron Hands determined that humanity itself and its inherent weakness was to blame for the heresy, and they devoted themselves to reason, logic, and the hatred of the flesh in order to remove that weakness from themselves, closely aligning themselves with the Martian priesthood. Rabute Guilliman also secretly gave an individual Mechanicus adept one Belisarius Call, an artifact known as the Sang Primus Portum, which contained the collected genetic material of the 20 Primarchs. He was tasked with the creation of a new, improved version of Space Marines, later known as Primaris Marines. I expect that we'll get at least one major book each devoted to the Adeptus Mechanicus and Call respectively, in addition to them making appearances in other stories. After the heresy, a movement also began to grow, led by the former Remembrancer Euphradi Keeler, and inspired by the Primarch Lorgar's teachings in the Lectitio Divinitatus. It taught that the Emperor of Mankind was not merely a powerful human, but in fact a god. While these beliefs existed before the heresy, they began to spread much more widely after the Emperor's internment, especially as the Primarchs began to disappear. Eventually, by the 32nd millennia, over 2/3 of the Imperium's population were members of the so-called Temple of the Savior Emperor, causing it to become officially recognized as a state religion by the Imperium, being reformed into the Adeptus Ministorum, or Ecclesiarchy. I'd expect to also see a lot more on the rise of the cult of the God Emperor over the Scouring series, and it'll probably be a major theme in the books. This is especially true since this story is heavily tied to that of Sigismund, the future first chapter master of the Black Templars and a major player in the Siege of Terra. I'd also imagine that we're going to be seeing plenty of him and his zealous crusading brothers, complementing the rise of the future state religion of the Imperium. In contrast, the Adeptus Custodes saw their influence decline after the Siege of Terra. Guilliman and their Captain General, Constantine Valdor, created the Edict of Restraint, tying the Custodes to the Sol system in order to guard over the Imperial Palace. They could still leave Terra in small numbers for specific missions, but it took until the opening of the Great Rift at the end of M41 for the edict to be fully dissolved, allowing the Custodes to march to war once more. I do feel that we will still see the Custodes as part of the Scouring, either as individual men or women, or in small groups, and we may even get to see them fight in full force for one final hurrah before their 10,000-year hiatus, but we'll just have to wait and see on that point. The forces of Chaos weren't the only enemies the Imperium had to face, however. Many Xenos races took the opportunity to raid the divided Imperium, most notably the Orcs and the Eldar. They too were driven back by the armies of the Imperium during the Scouring, although at great cost. I think it's good that they're already established as threats, as it provides a larger pool of antagonists to draw on, and can help show the stupidity and futility of humanity squabbling amongst itself in a cruel, uncaring galaxy. Given that the Orcs were recently defeated at Ullanor and later would get their own time in the spotlight in the War of the Beast, I think they won't be making quite as much of an impact in the Great Scouring. If I had to bet, I'd say we'd see far more of the Eldar, especially since they are connected to the disappearance of a Primarch, which we will get into later. I'd honestly like to see a villain trying to recreate the old Eldari Empire. That would honestly be a pretty cool book. As for other Xenos, we know that the Votann and at least some Necrons are active around this time, so they may show up as well. The Tyranids are probably too far away to appear, unless it's just their extreme advanced scout forces, and the Tau are still stuck as primitive tribes in their home world, so I highly doubt we'll see them. Chaos is definitely still going to remain the main antagonist of the Great Scouring, which is more than fine by me. I love Chaos, and they have tons of interesting stories to tell. As mentioned previously, the Traitor Legions either fled directly to the Eye of Terror, or were driven there after fighting on throughout the galaxy. The Eye, a stable warp rift formed after the birth of Slaanesh, acted as both a safe haven and a prison for the heretics. There they fought amongst themselves for centuries in an event either known as the Legion Wars or the Slave Wars, with each legion and warlord trying to carve out their own slice of hell to rule over. This squabbling continued until Abaddon the Despoiler, former first captain of the Sons of Horus, created the Black Legion from the ashes of his brothers, and led the forces of Chaos into the Imperium in the First Black Crusade in 781 M31. While I don't know if the Scouring will go as far as the First Black Crusade, I do believe that we are going to see the Slave Wars, along with the continuation of the stories of notable characters like Lucius the Eternal, Karn, and Typhus, and of course the Traitor Primarchs. Horus Lupercal famously fell in battle with the Emperor at the end of the Siege of Terror. His body was carried by his sons into the Eye of Terror, and was interred in the fortress of Lupercalios. The Sons of Horus then slowly fell into ruin, blamed by the other traitors for the failure at Terra and under constant attack. Eventually, their fortress was destroyed, and the body of their Primarch was stolen by the Emperor's children under Fabius Bile, an event that led to the end of their legion. The survivors either faded into irrelevance, or joined Abaddon's new Black Legion. After his defeat of the Imperial Fist in the Iron Cage, Perturabo was rewarded by the Chaos Gods with demonhood, although I expect when we see this event in the new Scouring series, he will be less than thankful given his distaste of chaos. He later led his legion to settle the demonic fortress world of Medrengrad, and they now fight as separate great companies, led by Chaos Lords known as Warsmiths. After being banished to the Warp in the Siege of Terra, Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons retreated to the planet of Soritarius, and became racked by the Flesh Change, a genetic curse that caused uncontrolled mutations. First Captain Ahriman, along with many other powerful sorcerers, cast a spell known as the Rubric of Ahriman with the goal of ending the Flesh Change for good. He succeeded, but in the process every non-psychic member of the 1,000 Sons was reduced to ash, trapped inside their armor, and forced to become mindless husks known as Rubric Marines. Magnus then banished Ahriman and his followers from the Legion, and he travels the galaxy, seeking knowledge and a way to undo his brother's curse. The Wordbearers and Death Guard legions are both relatively unique in that they managed to retain some of their pre-heresy cohesion. The Death Guard followed their Primarch Mortarion to the Plague Planet, where he mostly shut himself off from the affairs of the galaxy until M42. His sons, now Plague Marines in the service of Nurgle, continued to raid and spread blight and disease throughout the galaxy. In a similar vein, Lorgar of the Wordbearers ascended to demonhood sometime after the heresy, and isolated himself in the demon world of Sicarius in communion with the Chaos Gods. His sons, now led by the Dark Council headed by Erebus and Corphaeron, continued to campaign and spread their dark creed to the unenlightened masses. I do imagine that we will see more of Lorgar and the Wordbearers, and hopefully learn exactly what he did in order to attain demonhood. The World Eaters, minus their Primarch Angron after he was banished by Sanguinius in the Siege of Terra, also made it into the Eye of Terror. The Legion managed to maintain some semblance of cohesion until the Battle of Scalathrax. There they faced off against the forces of the Emperor's children, battling until the freezing nights of the planet caused both sides to take shelter in their bunkers. Karn, Akrita Angron and captain of the 8th Company, was so enraged by the perceived cowardice of his brothers that he took a flamer to their positions to force them to fight on, earning him the moniker the Betrayer, and forever shattering the unity of the World Eaters. The Emperor's children, by contrast, came out of the heresy in a fairly strong position. The large tally of slaves they had taken on Terra, thanks to abandoning their position in the siege, allowed them to have a leg up over the other traitor legions during the Slave Wars. And prior to the rise of the Black Legion, they were arguably the strongest force in the Eye of Terror. Fulgrim even led his legion for a time, before disappearing to a demon world after the Battle of Thessalia against the Ultramarines and their successors. Chief Apothecary Fabius Bile then took over command of the majority of the legion, before being defeated by Abaddon, as detailed in the novel The Talon of Horus. After this, their unity was shattered, with the Third Legion being reduced to little more than scattered bands of hedonists. As stated before, not all of the heretics immediately fled to the Warp. The Night Lords under Conrad Kurz remained in real space, basing themselves on the planet of Sagalsa in the Eastern Fringe, raiding nearby worlds and attacking the successors of the 13th Legion. Kurz, whose already fragile grip on reality continued to deteriorate after the heresy, eventually allowed himself to be killed by the assassin M. Shen, viewing it as vindication for his twisted beliefs. Leaderless, the Night Lord's Legion was eventually driven off by a combined assault from the Ultramarine successor chapters and fragmented into disparate warbands. The Alpha Legion suffered a similar fate. Although Alpharius had been killed by Rogel Dorn during the heresy, his twin Omegon had assumed his identity. He then led the Legion to the Galactic East to pursue their own goals, before eventually being brought to battle by the Ultramarines led by Guilliman on the world of Escrador. There, the Primarch of the 13th appeared to slay his brother, although instead of breaking like most legions would, the Alpha Legion rallied and succeeded in driving the Ultramarines from the planet. Since then, the Alpha Legion fractured into autonomous units and cells, some of which never left the Imperium for the Eye of Terror. Each warband has their own unique ideals. Some still fight for the Imperium while others have fallen fully to chaos, or have even more obscure motives. Given the Legion's reputation for treachery and misdirection, it is also possible that Omegon survived and is still operating from the shadows. Honestly, this is another plot that I'm really excited to get more information on. I just hope they actually give us some clarity and don't make things even more confusing. I'd also like to see the justification as to why most of the surviving Traitor Primarchs did not get involved in galactic affairs, with some exceptions, until the end of the 41st millennia. This is also true for the Loyalist Primarchs, although at least some of them have excuses. Ferrus Manus and Sanguinius were both slain in the heresy by their brothers, Ferrus by Fulgrim, and Sanguinius at the hands of Horus. They will still certainly be mentioned in the Scouring, and we will probably be seeing their sons in the Iron Hands and Blood Angels respectively struggle with their loss and how they can continue without them. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard is another example where I can easily understand why he left. After suffering heavy losses in the Dropsite Massacre, Corax attempted to rapidly recruit new legionaries using gene seed technology provided by the Emperor. Although thanks to Alpha Legion's sabotage, many of these recruits became twisted mutants that he was eventually forced to kill. Haunted by all these losses, after splitting his legion in the Second Founding, he locked himself in his chambers to beg for the Emperor's mercy. When he eventually emerged, he uttered only the words "Nevermore" and took his ship into the Eye of Terror. There he began to hunt Lorgar and his word-bearers, as well as other traitors, eventually transforming into a giant crow demon. I do need to see a follow-up novel going over this, because this is way too big and crazy a topic not to be explored more. Vulcan of the Salamanders, however, is a Primarch where his disappearance is definitely going to need some more clarification. Older lore was unclear on his exact whereabouts and if he even survived the heresy, although we now know that he indeed does. Given that he's also in the cover art for the Ashes of the Imperium novel, we can also assume he plays at least somewhat of a role in the Scouring. We are told that he and his surviving sons attempted to hunt down Fabius Bile, and that he eventually decided to leave the Imperium, not to be seen again until the War of the Beast. In modern 40k, he is still missing, although he left behind 9 artifacts, 5 of which have been found, and a book called the Tome of Fire that gives clues on their location. The Salamanders created the position of Forge Father, currently held by Vulcan Histan, to look for them, believing that if they manage to find them all, their father will return. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves is known to have continued to lead his legion for 2 centuries after the heresy, when in 211 M31 he abruptly left with all of his personal guard, saving Bjorn the Fell-Handed, who he ordered to remain behind and take up leadership of the chapter. The only thing that Russ told his sons is that he would return for the Wolf Time, or the End of Days. The Space Wolves still search for him in an event known as the Great Hunt, and some believe that he is seeking something known as the Tree of Life in order to restore the Emperor to full health. I personally think that we'll be seeing more of Leman Russ soon, as I believe he will be the next Primarch to return in 40k, although I could be completely wrong and look like a fool. We'll just have to wait till the end of the edition and see. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars also continued to lead his legion, before reportedly becoming lost in the Webway while fighting Dark Eldar. His story is fairly straightforward while also being irritatingly shallow. I really hope we get a lot more information on this, especially because it would be the perfect way to introduce a good Dark Eldar antagonist into the series. Shortly after the Siege of Terra, Lionel Johnson and his Dark Angels returned to their homeworld of Caliban, only to find themselves fired upon by the forces he had left there under the command of his old mentor Luther. The reasoning for their betrayal is unclear, and it's likely that each member of the First Legion on Caliban had their own motives, or was even completely unaware of the treachery. Regardless, the Lion flew into a rage. He ordered the planet to be bombarded, and he himself landed at the Legion's fortress monastery in order to slay Luther. The traitorous Luther, bolstered by chaotic power, managed to grievously wound his old friend. However, this act reportedly caused Luther to come to his senses and refuse to fight any further. The Chaos Gods, not to be denied their sport, then reportedly sent a warp storm that consumed the remains of the planet, along with the fallen followers of Luther, eventually spitting them back out across time and space. Only the fortress monastery of the Dark Angels survived, going on to become the Rock, headquarters of the modern chapter. Luther, now mad with grief and raving, was captured and secretly imprisoned by the Dark Angels, although the Lion was nowhere to be found. The Watchers in the Dark, small, robed inhabitants of Caliban, had secretly taken his unconscious body into the bowels of the Rock to heal, and he remained hidden there until his return in the Era Indomitus. Rabute Guilliman, as the new leader of the Imperium, was very active throughout the Scouring. The Ultramarines and their successors were at the forefront of the fighting, often with their Primarch at their head. That was until the Battle of Thessalia in 121 M31, where Guilliman was ambushed by the forces of Fulgrim and mortally wounded by his demonic brother. He was then kept in stasis on the Ultramarines' homeworld of Macragge, before his eventual return at the end of the 41st millennium. Interestingly, we actually see the Battle of Thessalia in the Plague Wars trilogy, although it's always possible that it could be rewritten and expanded upon in the Scouring proper. Rogel Dorn was the Primarch who remained in the Imperium the longest, taking command after Guilliman was mortally wounded, and even issuing orders for there to be a third founding of Space Marine chapters. He was eventually lost during the First Black Crusade, after boarding a Chaos battleship. Only his skeletal hand was recovered, which is kept as a relic by the Imperial Fist chapter. Of course, given that the rest of his body is unaccounted for, it's always possible that he survived and will one day return. After his disappearance, the High Lords of Terror were fully in control of the Imperium, and reason and order were slowly replaced with fear, superstition, and repression, resulting in the Imperium becoming the brutal, inefficient, and hellish regime we all know and love in modern 40k. I don't know if the Scouring series will go until the First Black Crusade. At this time, there is no confirmed endpoint or even number of books they're going to release. It's possible that they will go all the way until the Loss of Dorn, although that seems like an extremely large amount of time to cover, but for now we're just going to have to wait and see. So that's the overview of the Scouring and some of the major events that we can expect to see in it. There is of course more, especially since the Great Scouring has existed in lore for decades, as I said, but I wanted to stick to the broad strokes, especially since all of this is subject to change. While I don't think they're going to rewrite the whole story, I do expect there are going to be edits, expansion, and shakeups aplenty, just like there were with the Horus Heresy. There's even a built-in justification for any differences, as many of these events are presented with a little bit of intentional ambiguity due to being millennia-old tales in universe. I don't think that there's anything wrong with making some changes either. 40k has grown. When these stories were written, they were just background fluff, but now they'll need to be developed into something more substantial, especially given the popularity of the Horus Heresy, which itself made its own changes and expansions to the lore. It's okay to critique these changes, but it's also important to keep that perspective and not blindly stick to worshipping old lore just because it's old. We should judge the books on their own merit, based on how well they're written, and how well they fit into the modern context of 40k, not on how closely they adhere to a paragraph written 30 years ago to explain why you and your friends' Chaos Space Marine armies are able to fight each other. If you just can't wait till later this year to get started with the Scouring, there are some books that are actually already set during that time period. The Night Lords trilogy by Aaron Dembski Bowden, in addition to just being fantastic, has several flashbacks to the days after the Horus Heresy. Anthony Reynolds as Karn, Eater of Worlds, also covers the build-up to the Battle of Scalathrax, although it leaves off before the events of the actual battle. And Andy Semil has written several stories following the Flesh Terrors chapter and their first chapter master, Nasir Amit, during the events of the Scouring. Comment below what you're most excited to see happening in the upcoming Great Scouring series. If you enjoyed this video, please also like and subscribe, it really helps the channel and the YouTube algorithm, and if you want to support the channel more directly, consider becoming a member. For now, thank you and have a great day. Bye!